In this lecture, I'm going to talk about radical translation, which is a theory invented by my favorite philosopher, Quine. Willard van Orman Quine was a philosopher and logician. As you can see, he died in the year 2000, and he was probably the most important American philosopher of the 20th century. This is not only my opinion, this is quite common knowledge among academic philosophers. Quine studied under supervision of Rudolf Carnap, who was a member of Vienna Circle and a proponent of logical empiricism, if you remember. Quine spent 6 weeks in Prague during the winter of 1932 and 1933, and Quine quite often said that everything he needed to know about philosophy he learned in Prague under Carnap. Quine taught at Harvard University for his whole life, and among his students were some of the most important thinkers of contemporary philosophy and linguistics. So, for example, he was a teacher of Donald Davidson. I'm going to talk about him in my next lecture, and also of Noam Chomsky. Chomsky moved to Harvard University because he wanted to study under Quine, and he was his follower for some time of his intellectual career. Then he changed stances, and they got into quite huge controversy about behaviorism and nativism. I'm going to talk about it a lot later on. Quine wrote a lot on philosophy of language and logic and other philosophical fields, but his most important and probably largest monograph is Word and Object from 1960. This book is quite long and complicated, so I usually recommend a much shorter book that was published in 1995, a few years before Quine's death, and it's called From Stimulus to Science. It is a short book that presents Quine's ideas in a very concise and clear form. And you can also see from its name what was Quine's philosophical program. He wanted to understand how we create scientific theories based on our very scattered sensorial stimuli. That's it. I usually recommend Quine's writings because he was a very talented stylist. He had this gift to write in a very simple and clear manner. There are some researchers that deal with Quine's ideas who say that Quine's writing was similar to writings of Hemingway, for example. But I think that his writing style is much more similar to Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, those writers of detective novels from the 30s and 40s and 50s that are usually called noir. This is a picture of Humphrey Bogart from Maltese Falcon, and I really think that Quine's writing is quite similar to the style of those books. Let me show you an example. This is a quote from Quine's paper called On the Nature of Moral Values. This is the only text on ethics that Quine wrote in his life. And as you can see, these are the first sentences of the text. He writes in a very simple and casual style. Quote, "Imagine a dog idling in the foreground, a tree in the middle distance, and a turnip lying on the ground behind the tree. Either of two hypotheses, or a combination of them, may be advanced to explain the dog's inaction with respect to the turnip. Perhaps he is not aware that it is there, and perhaps he does not want a turnip." Unquote. This is quite heavy thought, I think, because in these simple words, Quine explains how dogs' psychology works and what are dogs' interactions with the environment it lives in. This is again a picture of Quine because I think that he was a very handsome, a good-looking guy. But let me tell you something more serious about his philosophy of language. In my last lecture, I tried to explain that in the half of the 20th century, analytic philosophy got into problems. The reason was that both schools of analytic philosophy met some problems they could not have solved. Ideal language philosophy was not able to create this ideal language they had dreamt of. And ordinary language philosophy somehow dissolved in linguistics, and ordinary language philosophers were not interested in real philosophical problems anymore. I think that Quine overcame these problems, both of ideal and ordinary language philosophy, because according to Quine, we have found the ideal language for the use of science. But Vienna Circus philosophers, they just didn't understand that they had this language at hand all the time. According to Quine, this ideal language is first-order logic and mathematical set theory, and that's all. According to Quine, this is everything we need in the language of science. And the second theory of Quine is also important because, according to Quine, we can analyze natural language logic in so-called regimentation. This is an attempt to deal with natural language using formal logic, first-order logic, and set theory, and do so-called regimentation. According to Quine, of course, we lose some stuff during the process of regimentation, but also this stuff probably wasn't very important at all. So, for example, if you use logic when dealing with language and you forget about poetic qualities or some emotional qualities of language, it doesn't matter, according to Quine, because he was interested only in the language that is used by scientists. And that's it. I want to explain again what this regimentation means, because it is a very important term in Quine's thinking. When we deal with regimentation, we are using means of formal logic to understand the natural language. And I believe that this is something what contemporary linguists do too. In my lecture on Wittgenstein's later philosophy, I introduced the problem of behaviorism and nativism. I believe that this dispute started in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Quine is also a behaviorist, as Wittgenstein was, and behaviorism in this sense means that we can study language only through verbal output, only through behavioral output. According to Quine and many others, we do not have any access into other people's minds. And the only thing we can do is watching their behavior, their usually verbal behavior, because this is the only way how we can understand what's going on in their heads. Let me quote a larger paragraph from Quine's Pursuit of Truth, again a quite short book from 1995. In psychology, one may or may not be a behaviorist, but in linguistics, one has no choice. Each of us learns his language by observing other people's verbal behavior and having his own faltering verbal behavior observed and reinforced or corrected by others. We depend strictly on overt behavior in observable situations. As long as our command of our language fits all external checkpoints, where our utterance or our reaction to someone's utterance can be appraised in the light of some shared situation, so long all is well. Our mental life between checkpoints is indifferent to our rating as a master of the language. There is nothing in linguistic meaning beyond what is to be gleaned from overt behavior in observable circumstances. As you can see, this is the same kind of argument that Wittgenstein used in philosophical investigations, because I think that it is almost the same as Wittgenstein's example with a beetle in a box. The point is that we do not need that stuff that's going on in our heads when dealing with linguistic meaning. We are not interested in people's psychology. The only important thing is linguistic meaning that is based completely on outer behavior of ourselves and other users of language. I have good reasons to believe that behaviorism, and mainly linguistic behaviorism, is still a persuasive account of language. It is still popular among philosophers, linguists, and cognitive psychologists, but it has also many opponents. And the most famous critique of behaviorism was Noam Chomsky. Chomsky criticized linguistic behaviorism mainly because of the alleged failure to explain language acquisition. According to Wittgenstein, Quine, and other linguistic behaviorists, language acquisition is not a complicated job. Small kids just observe their environments and they imitate how adults use language, and that's all. But Chomsky was not satisfied with this account, and his first important paper was a review of the book called Verbal Behavior by another behaviorist, Burrhus F. Skinner. And if you're interested in this stuff, please read Chomsky's review because it's still very influential. It's from 1959 and it was published in a quite prestigious journal, Language. According to Chomsky, mastery of a language is not a matter of being trained what to say. As Chomsky wrote, and I quote, "It is simply not true that children can learn language only through meticulous care on the part of adults who shape their verbal repertoire through careful differential reinforcement." Unquote. According to Chomsky, this is not enough. In this scenario, children would not be able to learn any mother tongue at all. This argument is usually called poverty of the stimulus argument, and according to Chomsky, language cannot be learned by mere sensory input. Its deep and abstract structure must be innate, because according to Chomsky, without this innate, deep and abstract structure, children would be helpless when learning any language. They have to have it. Without that, there would not become a linguistic beings at all. Quine wasn't impressed by Chomsky's poverty of the stimulus argument. The main reason was that Chomsky's argument stands on water. It's not based on any empirical evidence. Chomsky's argument is completely a priori, which means without any empirical basis. Chomsky created it in a comfy chair in his warmed-up office, and Quine was not satisfied with arguing in this non-empirical way. And this is the reason why Quine was still a behaviorist even after Chomsky's critique. Quine invented a behaviorist theory of language acquisition that is called radical translation, and I'm going to explain what's going on in here. Radical translation is a method to translate a completely unknown and unrelated language. According to Quine, when translating an exotic language, a field linguist can depend only on these two clues. The first one is verbal and non-verbal output of the speaker, and the second is shared sensorial stimuli of the events around the speaker and interpreter. That's it. There's nothing else. According to Quine, we do not need any innate, hardwired structures in our mind to understand what's going on in an exotic language. According to Quine, the aim of such a field linguist is to create something called a translation manual. And Quine thinks that the creation of this manual has two stages. Firstly, we have to translate simple occasion sentences. These sentences are based on direct experience. This is, for example, a sentence, this is a cow, or this is a child, or this is a chair, or something like that. And then we can move after this to more abstract sentences that include logical connectives like and, therefore, or, and stuff like that. The point of Quine's theory of radical translation is that any translation manual can be only of hypothetical character. This means that we must be always open to the possibility of its revision. I will give you an example, and it's written in a short sample that I gave you as a required reading. It is a sample from Quine's book, Word and Object. There is a passage about translation of a term gavagai. Imagine a situation when a field linguist walks through the forest with his Indian companion. This field linguist doesn't understand a language his companion uses. And the Indian shouts out at once the term gavagai in the situation when a rabbit is running across the path in the jungle. And field linguist has a lot of possibilities how to translate this simple term, this simple word, based only on the environment and the shared sensorial stimuli of the events. This field linguist can come to a conclusion that gavagai means a rabbit, but it can also mean something else. For example, running, or a running rabbit, or a tasty rabbit, or something like that. We can use radical translation because this is the only thing we have. This is the only mechanism we have for any translation, but we still must be open to the possibility that our hypothesis about translations might be wrong, and we have to be able to revise them in future when meeting counter evidence. This hypothetical character of translating from one language to another leads to something what Quine called indeterminacy of translation. According to Quine, there is always more than one correct method of translating sentences, and therefore we can have more translation manuals that are equally valid yet incompatible with each other. This multiplicity leads to indeterminacy of translation that does not regard only stylistic variants. The different translations of the same sentence can have also different reference, different meaning. To get back to my former example with gavagai, imagine two translation manuals. In one, the term gavagai is translated as a rabbit, and in the second translation manual, it is translated as a rabbit running. According to Quine's main idea, we probably cannot know which translation manual is better, because we cannot see, as I said, and I say it again, into the heads of other users of language. Everything we have is just their behavioral verbal output and the shared stimuli we have. It means that sometimes the translation is really indeterminate. And it might be true that the more we know about the language, the more we can be misled. There is no silver bullet. There is no miraculous solution to this trouble. We have to live with indeterminacy of translation because radical translation is the only way we have to understand what other speakers say. And this finding is also very important to understand how small children learn language, because small children are in the same role, their position is the same as of those field linguists. They are trying to understand completely exotic language. For small kids, any language is exotic and unknown, and they have to use radical translation again to get acquainted with it. I'm going to talk about radical translation and language acquisition again, for example, in my next lecture on Donald Davidson. That's going to be a very short one. But now I have just 3 questions for you about the required read-in. I gave you 2 pages, just this short sample from Quine's monograph, Word and Object. And my questions are: how is translation between kindred languages possible? What about translation between unrelated and exotic languages? The second question is, what do these words mean? Gavagai, low, evet, and yok. And the last one, what is the role of gestures in radical translation? How can a speaker express assent or dissent? This last question might be a bit complicated, but I am looking forward when we discuss it on our online meeting.